Okay, welcome to pizza class. This is a bit of an advanced lesson. This is my preferred method for making dough, but it's a little more complicated than the basic method that I showed you in the other class. And the reason for that is because I'm going to introduce a concept to you called Baker's percentages. Baker's percentages allows you to use weight measure rather than volumetric measure for all of your ingredients. And it's called Baker's percentages because it's often used in bread baking and pizza baking as a way of helping talk about all the levels of weight of ingredients based on the percent of flour weight, which I know is a little confusing. I'm going to do my best to explain it like this. When you figure out the ratio you want of all of your different ingredients, which is very critical for dough, especially the ratio of water to flour. That's the essential metric that you have to be sure of for your dough to come out properly. So for example, hydration percentage or percentage of water is usually in a range somewhere between 60 and 65%. So I like to use 61% hydration. More water you add, the more flexible, workable the dough becomes, and the lighter and more airy the crust is at the final product. So you've got to play with that for yourself. The percent of water is critical. As a result, bakers began to talk about the weights of their ingredients, water, yeast, sugar, salt, and those things as a percent of the total flour weight. That way they can be very, very precise about the amount of ingredients that are going into their doughs. Bakers get pretty scientific about this stuff, and so you might want to take some time to learn how bakers' percentages work. What you do is you work backwards from how big of a dough ball you want. How do you decide how big your dough ball should be? Well, that's based on the size of your pizza, and the thickness of your crust. If you think about it, the larger the pizza, the more dough you need to cover the area. And the thicker the crust, the more dough, of course, you need as well. I try to use about 310 grams of dough in my dough balls. So you take that and you work your way backwards from that. You want to eventually end up with 310 grams of ingredients. Now I want to make 2 pizzas. So I actually want 620 grams of all of my ingredients combined. Those grams all need to be added. I have 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. They need to combine to be 620 grams. You put in the size of the dough ball that you want and the amount of ingredients by percentage of flour that you want. For example, 61% hydration is 61% of flour for the water. I typically use 0.25% of yeast in my dough, and I usually use around 2.5% salt for my dough mixture. So with those percentages, I can use the calculator to calculate my actual grams. So that's Baker's percentages. It's extremely accurate, extremely scientific, and it allows you to modify slightly your ingredients and percentages to get after what you want for your dough style to be. And that's where I think this is more in the advanced territory. The other reason I call this my advanced method for making dough is that my mixing technique is different for this as well. I use what's called an autolyse. Autolyse is a fancy word for pre-combining the flour and the water to allow the flour to absorb into the water before I add the other ingredients. It's not really complicated, but it does actually allow for a slight subtle change in the flavor and consistency of the dough, which is why I've started doing it. Because we're using weights, I want to make sure that I tell you this does involve a scale, and you want a pretty good scale for this. The good news is you can get a scale like this, KD8000, on Amazon.com for $35, and it does everything that you will need it to do for pizza baking. In fact, this scale even understands Baker's percentages, and if you wanted to set your scale to measure out the percentages of your flour for your ingredients rather than use grams or ounces, this scale can do it. I still break my recipes down into grams, and that's what we're going to do today. I'll use my scale here. I'll turn this on, and I'll let that tarry, and it's going to come to 0. Now, the order of the ingredients that I mix for this method is slightly different as well. I'm going to actually combine things in steps. By introducing my autolyse, I'm going to put half of my flour and all of my water into my bowl first and mix that up. It'll be like a paste. So that's our first step. In my recipe, since I'm heading for 310 gram dough balls, my flour is going to be 378 grams of flour, and I want to use half of that in the first step. So we'll take our measuring bowl. So we're going to use half of our flour, which is 189 grams of flour. Again, we don't have to worry as much about the volumetric stuff and getting our flour packed just right, because now we're going by weight. It's going to be far more accurate, and it will allow you to reproduce your results the same every time. Take care of our first step by placing that flour directly into the mixing bowl. It's half of my total flour weight, 189 grams. Next up is our water. I'm going to put all of my water in at once. For my recipe today, that comes to 231 grams of room temperature water, or slightly above. Again, you don't want water to be too hot or too cold for this process. So 231 grams of water. Just there. 61% water. 231 grams of room temperature water. Make sure I get all that water into the bowl. And I'm going to go ahead and begin mixing at this stage. So we're going to create what's basically a paste of half of our flour, all of our water. While that's happening, I'm going to give that a couple of minutes to combine, and we're going to talk about the other two ingredients. So those other two ingredients are salt, which I like to use sea salt or kosher salt. Sea salt's my favorite, and the fine or medium grade grinding is the best for this stuff for in your dough. When I put sea salt on top of pizzas, I like to use the coarse stuff. It's really just visual, it looks good. But for in your dough, you want the smaller crystals because it blends better. So sea salt. And then for this recipe, we're going to use active dry yeast. Active dry yeast because we're going to put that right into our flour mix, and in fact, I can add this now. So we have what is basically 0.25% of my flour, or 1/4% by weight, and that comes out to, for this recipe, about 1 gram of active dry yeast. Go ahead and allow that to combine with our paste. Sometimes the paste needs a little bit of help mixing in, so I'll just mix that up, and oftentimes I'll even just do the whole mix of the paste by hand, just to make sure we get that consistency. You should really just see kind of a paste. If I lower that, that's just a paste looking substance there. All right, so that's going to sit for a couple of minutes, and now our water and half of our flour is nice and combined. And the next thing we're going to do is add a second round of flour. This time I'm going to use 1/4 of my total flour by weight. So that becomes our next step. 1/4 of my flour is about 95 grams. So we'll do that for our next step while our other batch is combining. So we started with half the flour, now we're adding 1/4, 95 grams, and then we'll add the last 1/4 as the last step. All right, there's our 95 grams, that's our second step. We'll add this flour now to our paste, just lowering the bowl here. Our second stage. And when we add this second bit of flour, we're also going to add our fourth and final ingredient, which is salt. Now for salt, like I said, I like to use 2.5% of my total flour weight. That gets me to, for this recipe, just about 10 grams. So we'll use our scale to measure out 10 grams of salt. And there we go. That again is our sea salt. We'll add that in here as well. Bring our bowl back up and combine those together on the low mixing setting. Again, we don't need to mix fast. We want to keep that slow mix happening so the yeast is now beginning to take over inside of our dough. At this stage, we should start to see those ingredients combining and some stringiness happening. That's the gluten forming inside of the dough, That's a really good thing. This is where you get to see some of those structures, which will result ultimately in great looking dough and great tasting dough when it comes out of the fermentation process. So we'll just allow that to combine slowly. You should start to see those strings forming. Sometimes I'll stop it and help it out a little bit, especially with a small batch. So we've got that combined. I'll just let that go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow that to mix one more time until I'm happy with it's combined. It's pretty good. Then I'm going to let that take a rest for another 2 to 3 minutes. Just so there's a couple of breaks in between here where we're allowing the chemistry to happen inside of the dough. Very important to allow these steps to happen. So I'll let that rest for a couple of minutes. And while it is, I'll be preparing my last round of flour, which again is a quarter of my flour. So I started with half of my flour. On my second step, I added a quarter of my flour. And on this final step, I'm adding the last quarter of my flour to give me 100% of my total flour by weight. That equals 95 grams of flour. There's 95 grams of flour, and our final step is ready to go into the mixing bowl. I'll lower the arm, add that final amount of flour, and we are ready to combine for the final stage of mixing. Now you'll feel like a scientist, and you'll have all kinds of numbers flying around in front of you, but what I typically do to minimize that is I write down these percentages for a typical batch. So in this case I'm making 2 dough balls. Maybe for you it's 4. Sometimes I'll make 10. When you do that, you have those written down, and you don't need to do a lot of math once it's completed. So basically we're going to allow this to combine the rest of the way, and now you'll start to see that full absorption like you would see on a typical dough ball. And it'll look a lot drier because we've now combined all of the different ingredients together. Now, just like in the basic recipe, you want to be careful not to overmix. So 3-4 minutes is about as long as we would allow this to happen. If you start to see the dough tearing, then you know that you're starting to rip those proteins, and you want to be really careful about that. So if it starts to tear and become almost unworkable from the dough mixer, which could happen, especially on small batches, then you may want to take it out and complete the rest of the combining with the hand kneading technique like we did in the basic lesson. So once I've done that and I've formed my ball, I'm going to put that ball, allow it to remain in the bowl, and I'm going to cover it with cellophane. This time rather than dirty another bowl, I'll just use the mixing bowl just directly. Cover that to keep the moisture in. Take a towel so we keep light out of there, and we're going to let that sit in a cool room temperature place, allow the chemistry to happen inside of the dough ball. Now we'll let that rise for almost 2 hours like that in the bowl before I punch it down and do anything else with it. So I'll see you in a few. Well, welcome back. We've waited 2 hours for our dough to rise in the mixing bowl, and we're ready to take that dough out, ball it, and get it ready for our 2 to 4 day fermentation process in the refrigerator. So we'll go ahead and remove the towel and the plastic wrap that we use to cover the dough, and what we should find is a lovely dough ball. See that we have a good sized dough ball now. It has definitely grown in size. I'm going to punch it down in the bowl. Again, that gets some of the gases out and allows the chambers to form. That will become important later. So there's our dough ball. And again, this is 2 dough balls that we made, and we measured out enough dough for 2 pizzas. So the total for that is $5.97, about 600. So we'll split that in 2. Like I said, we lost some of the weight. We were aiming for 2 balls of 310, so we've lost that a little bit. We're now at about 300, so those are fairly small little guys, but that's okay. You have total control over the size of the crust and pizza when it's time to stretch them. So I just got those measured out to be just about the same. Now that they're punched, they've bulk risen, and we're ready to form balls just like that for the refrigerator. So we've got our plastic container, just a little dab of olive oil in there. Let that ball roll around in there just a bit. It's almost too much there. And that will be ready in 2 to 4 days. So we'll put these in the refrigerator and they'll be ready for pizzas in no time. That's it for the advanced method of dough making, and believe me, it makes a difference. It's worth trying. So if you're into science, give it a try. And that's it for today's pizza class.